After its conquest by the Nazis, France becomes one of the most heavily fortified areas in history. But early in the war, plans are made to launch an invasion of this fortress across the English Channel. It is given the code name Operation Overlord. For thousands of American soldiers, the immediate effect of this decision is assignment to Great Britain to participate in the training and build-up of forces to be used in the invasion. Not for all will the transfer be so direct. Some will study invasion on the beaches of North Africa and Sicily and Italy before they ever set foot on French soil. But throughout the winter and spring of 1944, great convoys churn across the Atlantic to British ports. Into Britain they come by the thousands and tens of thousands. England in wartime is the land of blood, sweat, and tears. A nation blackened and battered by the fury of the Nazi Luftwaffe. But it's still England. And for young Americans on their way to war, there is much to see. Wartime Britain is a place supercharged with excitement. Literally the crossroads of the world, filled with uniforms from all the nations united in the war against the Axis. But there is work to be done here, and hard work. The grueling days and weeks and months are devoted to it. The training has one specialized objective: how to assault a hostile fortified coast. The American, British, and Canadian troops who train on England's landing beaches come to know well what it is they are getting ready for. The equipment they will use is ready too. Thousands upon thousands of vehicles, weapons, supplies of every conceivable sort. On the other side of the channel, the Nazis also know what the Allied forces are preparing for. And they are making preparations of their own. Along the coastline, they have built an Atlantic wall, which Adolf Hitler says will make Europe an impregnable fortress. The beaches and waters off them are heavily mined and booby-trapped and strung with obstacles. Behind them, heavy guns are embedded in steel and concrete, positioned to train on any invasion fleet which might appear in the Channel waters. By the spring of 1944, the Nazis know that an Allied invasion is imminent, but they cannot tell when it will come or where. They think the attack most likely will strike where the distance across the Channel is narrowest, at Calais. Consequently, their strongest forces and fortifications are concentrated here. The actual target is one of the best-kept secrets of the war. The attack will come along a 50-mile stretch of coastline in the province of Normandy, sweeping west from the Orne River to a beach on the Cotentin Peninsula, dominated by the vital port of Cherbourg. The assault is first scheduled for May, when weather conditions are expected to be at their best. Allied leaders planning Overlord are aware of Nazi estimates that the invasion will strike at Calais. They're ordering heavy bombing in the Calais area as well as in Normandy. In the months preceding the invasion, the tempo of air attacks steadily increases. Air fleets with their cargoes of destruction thunder out of British bases to pound at oil centers and industrial plants and airfields. In these months, the mighty Nazi Air Force is reduced to a ghost of its former power, and Allied superiority in the skies above France is won. destruction of transportation centers and rail lines is an important part of the invasion plan in order to isolate the battle area in Normandy and hinder the enemy's efforts to bring up men and supplies. It becomes clear that additional time will give the Air Force a better opportunity to accomplish this critical objective. It also is decided to expand the original invasion plan, which called for an attack along a 3-division front into one along a 5-division front. This makes the acquisition of more landing craft essential. For these reasons, D-Day is postponed from early May until early June. The men who will launch the attack continue their training through the cold early English spring. And then, inevitably, comes the day when all the training and rehearsals are over. It is time now for the curtain to lift on the real thing. Throughout May, the roads of England are clogged with convoys as men and supplies begin to move down to the ports and the loading areas. The English people cheer them on and pray for them as they pass. By the end of May, virtually all of southern England is one vast staging area. The realities of life now are small ones. For the individual man who will be called upon to execute the plan for the greatest assault ever proposed in the history of warfare, that plan comes alive now in a myriad of final details. Dozens of items to be issued and checked. Aboard the ships go the hardware of war, cargo which will be indispensable to the fighting man if he is able to secure a toehold on the hostile beach and expand it into a lodgement area, vehicles and the fuel to run them, rations and fresh water to drink, medicine, weapons and ammunition, bulldozers and bridges, the long invisible line of equipment which stands behind every statistic of victory. Finally, the very heart of the striking force completes the movement. The men who will spearhead the invasion board the ships which will carry them to their long-awaited hour of decision. In file after file they come, in all the ports where the invasion fleet lies at anchor, moving up the gangplanks in a long, solemn shuffle, whose cadence becomes the heartbeat of history. Extensive movement from shore to ship, swiftly and effectively executed, is a masterpiece of logistical operation. But with the mechanics of logistics done, the eye of destiny is now on these men who board their vessels bringing only what they can carry on their backs and in their hearts. The fateful hours that lie beyond the darkness ahead belong to them, to do with as they can, while the world waits in wonder and hope. They may not see themselves as the sword-bearers of a crusade, but they know well enough what depends on their effort, and the ultimate preparation is for each man to make himself. Now begins a new period of waiting for the one final word. An invasion ship is a lonely ship, writes a correspondent who is there. It is a strange and suspended world, but heavy with memories of the more familiar world left behind. Unknown to the men in the tense atmosphere of the invasion fleet, tension is also high at Supreme Headquarters. Overlord, scheduled for June 5th, has been postponed 24 hours because of the worst channel storm in 20 years. Now, weather conditions predicted for the 6th are far from ideal. But another postponement will mean a wait of at least 2 weeks for the right conditions of moon, tide, and weather. The possible consequences of delay are staggering. Loss of secrecy, drop in morale, strengthening of enemy defenses. One man must make the decision. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander. He makes it. The invasion will go as scheduled on the 6th. The great armada begins its ponderous move into the Channel waters. The men who will actually be the first into France are still back on English soil. Paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division are to jump behind enemy lines to secure the flanks of the invasion area. On the eve of the invasion, the Supreme Commander visits some of them. I found them in fine fettle, General Eisenhower is to write later, admonishing me that I had nothing to worry about. Theirs is to be the biggest airborne invasion ever attempted to this time. The crucial hours of darkness ahead will make almost superhuman demands on them. Bad weather and anti-aircraft fire will scatter many of them over a much wider distance than is planned. They will be forced to fight the enemy as they find him in the night, in small groups and on unfamiliar terrain. But dawn will find the flanks at either end of the Normandy battlefield held by these first invaders. None of this, of course, can they know as they board their planes in the late hours before D-Day. Ghost fleet lifts from its British bases. The carriers were the airborne warriors. The gliders carrying weapons and heavy communications equipment. Midnight skies over Normandy are suddenly alive with the dark shapes of men who will bring the first fires of D-Day to Fortress Europe. In the waters of the English Channel, dawn lights up the invasion fleet plowing steadily toward the Normandy coast. With almost 5,000 seagoing vessels, the historic armada is the greatest ever assembled. The sea is incredibly rough. For many of the warriors aboard the vessels pitching helplessly on the rolling water, seasickness is a cruel enemy to be fought before the Germans are ever faced. An hour before the first troops are scheduled to hit the shore, a naval bombardment opens up on the enemy's coastal defenses. The Nazis are at first confused about the Allied invasion. They are not aware a full-scale assault is in the making.
Feindliche Schiffe in Sicht. Achtung, feindliche Invasionsflotte in Sicht. Die Invasion, die wir erwartet haben. Wir werden sie mehr zurückwerfen. Nicht schießen, bis das Signal gegeben ist.
Allied air forces, which have been protecting the assault convoy throughout its trip, join the attack on enemy targets. In wave after wave, they roar overhead above the Armada. In the ships of the invasion fleet, the men can hear the steady pounding of their fire on the enemy's positions, and they wonder hopefully if anything can be left alive on shore. In a world of nausea and fear and tension, the trip to the beaches begins. At the spear tip of this historic seaborne attack are some 3,000 men, American, British, and Canadian troops, who will hit in the first wave. Behind them, the main body of ground forces will land in succeeding waves. British and Canadians are to take the 3 eastern beaches. The Americans are to secure the 2 on the west. Exposed to fire from an enemy they cannot yet see, they rock toward land. Hour. On beaches called Utah and Omaha, and Sword and Gold and Juneau, they come ashore. On the murderous sands of Normandy and its rim of watery hell, they push against the gates of Fortress Europe, and the fates of war and freedom await their performance. Enemy resistance varies in degree from beach to beach. But for every man there, the new world of Normandy is a world of private agony and chaos. And no man can see the broad design beyond it, on a scale so epic that words written long ago by William Shakespeare could have been composed for the 6th of June, 1944. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named. 3 hours after the invasion begins, it is clear that the Allies have their foothold, however precarious. The electrifying announcement is made in London. It is night across the United States. Swing shift workers in war plants are the first to hear the news.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France, unquote. This is the only word we have at this time. There is no indication yet of exactly where the invasion took place or how many men were involved.
The news comes to America on this June day of 1944, bringing a swell of hope and pride, and anxiety, too. For great victories in war must always be bought dearly. And the price paid this day for the Allied hold on the beaches of Normandy is not cheap. But although the cost is steep, the results are incalculable to the plan of battle. The beachhead soon expands from foothold to lodgment. Men and weapons and equipment pour ashore. Within 12 days, almost 600,000 men and 90,000 vehicles are on the beaches, massed for the drive inland. 10 months of war still lie ahead in Europe. Bitter fighting through the hedgerow country of the lodgment area. Hard grinding combat in the cities that lead from Normandy to the banks of the Elbe. Many men yet will fall. Many reverses will be suffered. Many triumphs recorded. But in the main, the progress of battle will follow the bold plan conceived in Allied councils and brought to flaming life by the men who stormed the Normandy beaches on a day which will forever be known as D-Day, who unlocked the gates of Fortress Europe so that a monstrous evil could be pursued and destroyed.
For a fateful period of time, history waits on tensed men trapped in the mud-soaked fields of Normandy until they are able to break out of that agony of isolation and move toward their destiny, changing history's course. This is that story. It is the story of Breakout and Pursuit.
Hello, I'm Alexander Scorby. With its eye on the future, the United States Army is mindful of its past. It has a Department of History whose task it is to preserve that past, with all its glory and all its tragedy, with all of its wisdom and with all its failures. For more than a decade, this department, called the Office of the Chief of Military History, has been working on a project of epic proportions, the operations of the United States Army in World War II. More than 50 volumes in this series have already been published. It will total 80 or more when it's completed. The most recent is Breakout and Pursuit by Martin Blumenson. Its subject is what happened on the continent of Europe in July and August of 1944, 2 crucial months that will light the fire of memory in American minds. Or perhaps not in all minds. Time moves swiftly, and in its headlong rush, it condenses the events behind us. One magic and memorable day, we were across the English Channel, our feet at last on the Normandy beaches. Soon after, we were lighting the skies of liberated Paris. And perhaps only those who were there, or whose lives were changed by what happened there, remember that 80 days of war and its uncertainty lay between the two events. This book is a sweeping record of those days. It's a big book, both in size and in scope. Heroes crowd its pages, the ones whose names became carved on the consciousness of the world, and the obscure ones who held the final hope of triumph in their 2 hands and in their hearts. It's a book with a happy ending, where it tells of a great victory, or series of victories. But it's not so much concerned with victory itself as with the structure on which victory rested. The decisions, the agonizing waiting, the frustrations, the bold hopes, the daring executions, the errors and the logic, from all of which together victory ultimately came. Now, here's the situation as the book and the action begin. United States and British and Canadian troops on the 1st of July 1944 were engaged in battle with German forces on the Channel coast of France. The cross-channel attack, beginning on the 6th of June, had accomplished the first phase of the invasion. second phase called for the Allies to expand their foothold. They needed space to maneuver, room to handle the large amounts of men and materiel streaming over from England. Before they undertook the decisive attack toward the heart of Germany, they wanted this area. But 3 weeks after the invasion, they had only this tiny beachhead, the British here and the Americans here. The greatest single disappointment of the invasion had been the inability to take Caen, which blocked the approaches to the Seine. But the British troops attempting to capture the city had been thwarted. The best hope now lay in the ability of the American forces to strike south and then west and take the key ports in the province of Brittany. A major impediment to this course of action was the terrain the troops would have to fight through. Marshy land enclosed into thousands of separate little fields by hedgerows, behind every one of which it seemed the Germans were well entrenched. And what of these Germans who faced the Allies in the soggy fields of Normandy? They were disheartened, certainly, by the success of the Allied landings. Moreover, the German people were exhausted after 5 years of war and with the effort of fighting on 5 fronts. But the troops themselves were far from beaten. They were skillful, tough troops, seasoned by experience. Their discipline was sharp. Their morale was high. The Germans had a new weapon, the deadly V-1, a small pilotless jet aircraft which had begun to fall on England in the middle of June. A supersonic V-2, even more devastating than the V-1, was almost ready for operational use. These weapons gave the Germans hope of redressing their discouraging situation. Adolf Hitler was himself directing the war. Believing that eventually the Germans would be able to launch a large-scale offensive which would drive the Allies from the continent, he planned in the meantime to pin them down in Normandy and prevent them from using their mobile power. Although some of his commanders now recommended limited withdrawals to make their defensive positions stronger, Hitler refused. To withdraw for any reason at this time seemed to him to admit defeat. So, as American forces prepared to strike across the hedge-rowed lowland where the Germans had erected strong defenses, Hitler announced that those defenses were to be held. The American attack began in the dawn hours of July 3rd, and it lasted for 17 rain-soaked, agonizing days. The soggy, hedge-rowed terrain immobilized the mechanized power of the ground forces. Painful advance was measured in yards, a hedgerow at a time. Like the steady rain which fell over the entire operation, a sense of despair and frustration touched all those who participated. The last action in this offensive was the battle for Saint-Lô. The Allies wanted Saint-Lô for a number of reasons. Its prestige value, the effect its capture would have on the Germans, and as an access to roads leading south. After a week of bitter fighting, they got it. The cost was high, as was true in all the hedgerow fighting. But the town was secured, and in the process, a memorial was created. An infantry battalion commander killed before the gates of the city was carried into Saint-Lô with the liberators. His body was placed on a pile of rubble, an impromptu shrine to the qualities of courage and sacrifice that had made the drive to Saint-Lô possible. The triumph belonged to the dead as well as to the living. The results of this July offensive were disappointing. The greatest gain had been only 7 miles. The need was urgent for a way to break out of the containment of the Normandy situation, to get onto flat, dry land so that the Army's mobile force could be unleashed. General Omar Bradley, commander of the American troops, had been forming a plan for some time. Bradley's plan, which was codenamed Cobra, was to gather together an overwhelming concentration of ground troops, twice as great a force as would normally be used on such a narrow front, and combine it with a massive assault from the air by the Army Air Force. In war, heavy bombers are used primarily for strategic purposes, to knock out major long-range targets such as railheads and manufacturing plants deep in enemy territory. To use heavy bombers for tactical reasons, that is, to help the ground forces obtain an immediate objective, was quite risky, mainly because of 2 factors. The heavy bombs dropped from the big planes created craters and debris, which became serious obstacles to the ground troops. And because our own forces would have to move far back from the front to escape the damage of the bombers, the time interval between the air bombardment and the ground forces' attack on the target was too long. It gave the enemy time to recover and marshal his defenses. Bradley thought that in this case, he could eliminate many of these dangers, if not all the risks. No plan in war is foolproof. But this one was bold, and if it worked, it would enable the Allies to break the stalemate in which they'd become bogged down. Brittany was still the eventual goal. The first step toward it would be the line between Coutances and Caumont. Between the end of the earlier July offensive and the launching of Cobra, there was a lull for about 1 week. For the weary American troops, it was a welcome respite, a time to relax. On July 20th, a dramatic event electrified the world and revealed that there was no relaxation inside the enemy camp. Hitler himself announced that a cabal of high-ranking army officers had tried to assassinate him with a bomb in order to seize political power. The abortive coup had little effect on the military situation. It revealed no widespread discontent with Nazi rule among the armed forces. The combat soldier was too busy simply trying to remain alive. And the information about the German situation which the Allies wanted, as Cobra neared its jump-off date, was of a considerably more immediate nature. Did the enemy have enough reserves available to counter the attack? Was the Luftwaffe capable of intervening? And finally, would the Germans employ the V1 or V2 or some other secret weapon? These were the questions that haunted the Allied camp as it waited to unleash Cobra. July 24th was the day scheduled for the attack. Because the day was heavily overcast, however, with inadequate visibility for air attack, the operation was postponed. Unfortunately, the postponement order reached the English air bases too late to hold back all the planes scheduled for the attack. bombardment from the planes which did not receive the postponement order was not great enough to damage German positions seriously. But it was sufficient to alert them to the threat of a ground attack. And German artillery gave American forward units a hard time for the rest of that day. For General Bradley, an immediate and urgent decision had to be made. The prospects were improving for good weather the next day. Should Cobra be launched, even in the face of the possibility that the Americans had now lost the important element of tactical surprise, or should it be postponed at least for several days, which might then give the Germans a chance to prepare even stronger defenses? Bradley's decision. Cobra would strike again at 11 o'clock the next day. Again on the morning of July 25th, the planes came. One observer called the seemingly endless waves of planes the most imposing aerial parade I have seen since the beginning of this long war. In all, they dropped more than 4,000 tons of destruction. But the tactical effect was not immediately clear. Did the bomber attack destroy the efficiency of the German troops? No one could tell. General J. Lawton Collins, 7th Corps commander, who was to spearhead the attack, had little time to ponder the question. For better or for worse, Cobra was launched. The troops moved out at once. Their immediate objectives were the towns of Marigny and Saint-Gilles. Capture of those towns by the infantry would give the Americans control of the roads leading south, and Collins would then be able to catapult his mobile armored forces forward. It seemed reasonable to assume that if the air bombardment had destroyed the German defenses, the infantry troops would be able to reach and secure their objectives without great difficulty. To their surprise, they met strong resistance. At the end of the first day of the attack, Marigny and Saint-Gilles were still in enemy hands. Because the entire success of Cobra depended on a 7th Corps breakthrough, Collins decided to gamble. It would prove to be one of the fateful decisions of the campaign. He pondered the possibilities and the risks and decided to put his armor into action. The gamble paid off. In mid-afternoon of the 26th, one armored column, having cracked the enemy's defenses around the town, rolled through Saint-Gilles. There was no longer any doubt. The German line had definitely been penetrated. The 7th Corps had achieved its breakthrough. But the drama of the breakthrough did not end at the Coutances-Caumont line. The drama lay in the development of the breakthrough into a breakout of major proportions. The decision to accomplish this was General Bradley's. He had achieved the limited victory he had sought. Cobra had been a success. He could stop now. But he sensed from their disorganized reaction that a deep wound had been inflicted on the Germans. The Americans pressed their attack through rapidly crumbling German defenses. By the end of the month, United States forces stood at the base of the peninsula, at the gates of the province of Brittany. And a nightmarish phase of the battle, the war of stalemate, was over. Cobra and its exploitation were among the most solid accomplishments of the war. Let's visit now with the man who more than any other was responsible for this achievement, General Omar Bradley. General Bradley, as you look back on Operation Cobra, what seems to you to be the real secret of its success?
I think several factors were very important in contributing to our success. First, as always, the aggressiveness and the fighting spirit of the American soldier. Second, the marvelous teamwork displayed by the combat armies and our Air Force. And third, the magnificent alertness of my subordinate commanders and their ability to take advantage of the breaks. In particular, General Collins' bold move.
This book must be like, well, like traveling down an old and familiar path to you, General Bradley.
Well, it is, yes. But it's more like traveling down a road in the daylight that at the time you had to take it was in the dark.
Thank you very much, General Bradley. Operation Cobra, of course, is only one action in the crowded and historic 2 months which Breakout and Pursuit reviews. Much of the subsequent action was more colorful, but Cobra was the key which unlocked the door to those spectacular victories. The reaching of Ardennes signified the culmination of the breakthrough and the point at which our forces split for the westward and eastward drives in the breakout. To the west, there was the dash across Brittany, where the ports of Saint-Malo and Brest finally became prizes of conquest. To the east, there was the repulse of the German counterattack at Mortain, where the American infantrymen withstood the onslaught of 4 German armored divisions and turned back Hitler's attempt to halt the Allied mobile column. The Allies closed at Argenton and Falaise, where they virtually destroyed 2 German field armies. The drive east to the Seine River, climaxed by the liberation of Paris, when the civilized world thrilled to a symphony of joy and delight. The flowers, the kisses, the songs, and the wine. Finally, the triumphant and dramatic pursuit of the retreating Germans beyond the Seine to the border of the enemy's homeland, and the Siegfried Line, where a new phase of the war awaited. And thus the epic weeks ended. The short span of time in which the shape of final victory began to emerge, with the successful breakout from the hedgerow country and the pursuit across the heart of France.
August the 15th, 1944, the makings of an Allied invasion in the Mediterranean. Soon, these men will step ashore along enemy-held beaches, and an operation called Dragoon will be underway. Behind the landings on the coast of southern France that day in August lay one of the most controversial command decisions of the entire Second World War. A decision born in the grand strategy showdown talks of 1943, involving the heads of state of 4 major powers in Cairo, Egypt, and in Tehran, Iran. With these world leaders and their military commanders rested the lives of tens of thousands of fighting men, as well as the ultimate outcome of the war in Europe. Exotic settings were to provide a fitting background for the approaching heads of states conferences. The first was to be held in Cairo beside the Nile River. The second top-level talks would be held in Tehran, capital city of Iran in the once fabled land of Persia. 2 separate meetings were required since Russia would not attend the conference with representatives of nationalist China. At that time, China was at war with Japan. Russia was not. Also at that time, in 1943, Allied air power was methodically destroying the German war machine. Bombs fell on Germany around the clock, day and night. Several months before the conferences, plans were made to launch Operation Overlord, a major cross-channel attack into France, and at the same time Operation Anvil, a diversionary attack against southern France, later codenamed Dragoon. There were reports that a move north beyond Rome would be favored by both Britain and Russia, rather than operations in southern France. Within the shadows of the Egyptian pyramids and the Sphinx, the first of the history-making conferences began in November 1943. Highlighted by the presence of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. During the Cairo conference, considerable time was taken to discuss the relationship of the proposed operations in Europe as they would influence the continuing war in the Pacific. Topics of extreme importance to the Generalissimo. Immediately following the Cairo meeting, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill flew to Tehran for the conference that was to decide the fate of Operation Dragoon. The Tehran meetings were held in the Russian embassy, with maximum security provided. Churchill later said in his memoirs that Molotov reported Soviet secret intelligence had uncovered a plot to kill one or more of the big three. The day of the conference, troops and police were everywhere around the embassy. This was one of the most significant gatherings of Allied heads of state and military leaders since the beginning of World War II. The big question mark was Russia. Would the Soviets prefer the move into southern France proposed by America, or would Stalin, like Churchill, prefer new efforts in Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean? The answer came only after much deliberation. Stalin, apparently playing a waiting game, was in a position to side with Roosevelt, who continued to stress the need for operations in northern and southern France. Or Stalin could side with the Prime Minister, who forcefully appealed for new operations in Italy and on into the Eastern Mediterranean. The rumors before the conference that Stalin would favor the British proposal did not materialize. The grand design for victory in Europe had finally gelled. As it turned out, Stalin favored a pincer-type operation against northern and southern France. This, he explained, would give the Russians the second front they had long sought. But following the conferences, a number of related pressures began building against Operation Dragoon. The big push at Anzio had not been powerful enough to break the stalemate in southern Italy. Rome was still a long way off, and until Rome was taken, D-Day could not be set for Dragoon. Britain insisted on getting the Italian campaign moving again, and this would be a drain on forces intended for Dragoon. The newly appointed Overlord commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was well aware that strategic focus was upon him. He needed Dragoon in support of the Normandy invasion, yet such things as the shortage of landing craft began to make Dragoon appear less feasible. At General George C. Marshall's suggestion, the American chiefs of staff delegated their authority to Eisenhower so he could confer with the British and determine who was to have logistical priority in the critical weeks ahead. Talks with the British resulted in compromise action. For the present, the fighting in Italy was to have priority over all other Mediterranean operations. Meanwhile, plans for Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, were to continue. But despite spirited Allied attacks in Italy, the stalemate there persisted. It was decided that Operation Dragoon, as a simultaneous attack, had to be canceled. Focus shifted completely to an intensified drive in Italy. The first big objective was Rome. On June 4th, the Allies victoriously rolled into Rome. Two days later, the first assault waves of Operation Overlord went onto the Normandy beaches. Eisenhower continued to present a strong defense for supporting Overlord with an invasion of southern France. Britain again stressed a desire to advance north toward Hungary through the Ljubljana Gap. Both Marshall and Eisenhower pointed out the need for a new major port in the south of France for the passage of the 40 to 50 divisions waiting in America to fight in Europe. The port of Marseille in southern France would provide the facilities needed. In Naples, preparations began immediately in compliance with a Supreme Allied decision to launch Operation Dragoon on August 15, 1944. The aftermath of any command decision to prepare for an invasion is never a small operation. 7th Army's assault force was the 6th Corps with its 3 infantry divisions, the 3rd, 36th, and 45th. They alone represented a force equal in number to the population of a middle-sized American city, over 80,000 men, all seasoned veterans of one or the other of the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. These men were to land on the main beaches on D-Day, another 33,500 to be ashore by D+4. The logistics involved in planning for this task force was a staggering consideration. Transportation alone, with all kinds of surface craft, ships, and vehicles, required the greatest skill and coordinated planning. For weeks before August 15th, loading operations had been going on at a variety of Italian ports, mainly in Naples, but also in small ports from Pozzuoli to Salerno, a steady procession of mechanized movement into the holds of hundreds of ships. In the days following the capture of Rome, this assault force had undergone concentrated pre-invasion training, with stress and physical conditioning, individual combat training, simulated amphibious landings. All these preparations, added to the actual combat experience of each unit, made this one of the best prepared assault forces ever to get ready to hit a beach. By the 12th of August, men, weapons, equipment, and supplies of the entire command were aboard ship and on the way. The coordination of such a complex armada was itself one of the most challenging tasks of the invasion. Every movement precisely timed. All convoys speeding toward the west coast of Corsica to rendezvous and then move north to France. For most, this time aboard ship was not a new experience. Other campaigns had taught them how to wait, as well as how to fight. The invasion fleet was now well on its way. The first Special Service Force landed on the offshore islands of Levant and Port-Cros the night before the main landing. At about the same time, French commando units struck on the flanks of the mainland assault beaches. At Allied airstrips throughout the Mediterranean theater of operations, bomber and fighter crews received their final briefings. The air offensive called for flights of bombers to attack over 70 targets in or near the assault area. The task force was now nearing the mainland, an array of nearly 900 ships and craft sailing under their own power, and some 1,350 small landing craft aboard the larger ships. that same morning, airborne troops mounted up on airfields not far from Rome to be transported to the French mainland. Bombing attacks continued on coastal defenses. Fighter aircraft took off from Corsica and Sardinia, moving quickly to France. They swooped inland to scrape German ground forces that were moving toward the beaches. The airborne troops jumped over the pre-selected drop zones, not far from the port of Fréjus, where Napoleon once landed by ship to begin his last 100 days as Emperor of France. The primary mission of the airborne troops here was to prevent German movements into the main assault area. Decoy bombings down the coast diverted the enemy for just so long. By now, they knew we were here. Their coastal guns opened fire on the Dragoon task force. We returned the fire. Just before the troops went in, rocket ships, new in the war, fired on the beaches. Now it was time to disembark into the landing craft. Each hour was a matter of minutes away. At about the same time in Italy, glider-borne troops took off, heading toward the area of Le Mouilly in France, a suspected enemy assembly area for counterattack. Supporting fire for the landing continued in all its fury. Only seconds now before they hit the beach. The first troops to land moved inland a few hundred yards and held on, while subsequent assault waves hit the beach. The first messages began to trickle back to the command ship. Landings on time. Enemy opposition light. Beach operations going better than expected. In a daylight assault such as Dragoon, getting the men landed to consolidate the beaches quickly and in depth is the first consideration. The next mission was to bring in the machinery of war, the supporting weapons, tracked vehicles, all the equipment and supplies that would make it possible for the Allies to reorganize quickly for the advance to the northwest. first intelligence estimates were gratifying. 2 German divisions had been decisively crippled. Within hours of the first landings, more than 2,000 prisoners had been taken. Along about mid-morning, the glider-borne troops arrived at the Lemuy area. Rough terrain and high winds made landings hazardous, and there were casualties. But overall, Allied casualties those first few hours were relatively light. The push inland began following consolidation of the beaches between Saint-Raphael and Cavalet. An ideal offensive is one in which the enemy is trapped without means of escape. Operation Dragoon was approaching that ideal, but the Germans maneuvered and fought back with everything they had. French troops concentrated on Marseille and Toulon, while the Americans moved toward Avignon. Camouflaged enemy vehicles out of action, the result of effective air and ground supporting fire. Less than 2 weeks after the landings, an all-French assault force entered Marseille. A vital port city such as this does not fall without a struggle, especially when Hitler ordered Marseille to be held. The French forces finally took the city on August 28th. Marseille could soon be receiving troops direct from America. And everywhere was the wreckage of war. Soon, the French took still another port, Toulon, another strategic prize. A waterfront city showing the thoroughness of our aerial strikes. A variety of quick access routes existed up from the assault beaches of southern France, and the Allies wasted no time clearing them for the passage of infantry, artillery, and armored units. In a special order of the day, the commanding general of the 7th Army, Lieutenant General Alexander M. Patch, told his men, "Keep advancing. The enemy," he said, "is perplexed and stunned, and the opportunity for decisive results is ahead of us." While the troops pushed on, the enemy was kept off balance with our artillery fire. The enemy was becoming disorganized. Armored and infantry elements continued the advance north. Their job was clear-cut, but not easy, to stop a German withdrawal through the Montélimar Gap. The terrain would be getting tougher now, maneuvering more difficult. There were rivers to cross. There were steep slopes to climb, uphill all the way, and with the enemy looking down our throats. Artillery engaged in a duel with enemy guns. In the Montélimar sector, heavy fighting continued during the last days of August. Some of the German forces managed a hasty withdrawal. North of Montélimar, the Allied forces pursued the retreating German troops. On numerous occasions, the French forces of the interior, or Maquis, assisted Dragoon forces in seeking out and destroying the enemy. Their knowledge of the French countryside, their courage and fighting abilities were valuable assets to the Allied advance. Recognition of the Free French efforts in fighting and capturing the enemy was evident when General Patch awarded to Mac Romont, local Maquis leader, a Silver Star. September 3rd, troops of the French 1st Infantry Division entered Lyon and were warmly received by their countrymen. Our forces continued to sweep north. Less than 1 month after the landing on southern France, troops of Operation Overlord had fought down from Normandy beaches and linked up with the advance element of Dragoon, 13 miles west of Dijon. This meant a third army group, the Dragoon forces, was now added to the 2 army groups already under Eisenhower in the Overlord operations in northern France. Dragoon forces had captured more than 115,000 prisoners and had liberated practically all of eastern and southern France, decisively moving toward the climactic phase of World War II. There is perhaps no happier sound than the noise of a newly liberated town. The response of a grateful people was hard to leave, but there was still a war to win, and so the troops moved on. The command decision which created Operation Dragoon was the result of discussion on the part of some of the most astute political and military minds of our century. A decision carried out by such commanders as 7th Army's General Patch, 6th Corps' Lieutenant General L.K. Truscott, Jr. A decision transformed by the individual soldier into effective action on the battlefield. General Eisenhower had this to say about the true hero of the battle, the American fighting man.
He has surmounted charges into desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.